Hip hip cheerio, old boy. It's just a ruddy good time empire. Colonialism, conquering the world for the good of the crown. I say, old chap, is there a greater feeling drawing lines on a map that will affect the world for decades in absolutely horrible, horrible ways? Well, that's what we're talking about today. How did what Britain left behind impact the world today? And are most of the problems in the world today a result of London simply sticking their nose where it didn't belong 200 years ago? And spoiler alert, the answer's kinda yes. Where best to start but Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. During the British Empire's long reign as top dog, it sought to stamp its authority all over the world, seizing power, enriching itself, and challenging other empires for influence, like Russia, which prior to its collapse into communism was one of the major powers in Asia. In the 19th century, Britain and Russia had been battling it out for influence over Afghanistan, known as the Great Game. In trying to win the ultimate prize of Kabul, 3 Anglo-Afghan wars were fought during the 1800s that caused much destruction and death. But as the 20th century was on the horizon, something changed that ensured more violence would come. In 1983, the British, Sir Mortimer Durand, and the Emir of Afghanistan, Abdur-Rahman Khan, signed an agreement to officially delineate the border between British India and Afghanistan, appropriately known as the Durand Line. It followed geographical features, but cut directly through individual villages, separating families and splitting the Pashtun people who lived there in two. Nowadays, the Durand Line forms the boundary between Afghanistan and modern-day Pakistan. The division has led to an independence movement in the region to reunite the Pashtuns under one area. Millions of Pashtuns live in Pakistan today, but some are driven into the arms of militant Pashtun organizations like the Taliban in order to reunite their people. So, the Durand Line represents a cultural scar as well as acting as a staging ground for terror attacks. Such radical solutions may not have taken root if the Pashtuns were not split apart back in the 19th century. So, Britain's colonial line drawing has led to over a century of bloodshed that persists to this day. Next time, maybe ask the locals? Today's video is brought to you by Surfshark, your ultimate online privacy and security tool. Whether you're browsing the web, streaming your favorite shows, or traveling abroad, Surfshark has you covered. With unlimited devices on one account, your whole household can stay protected. It blocks ads and malware, it encrypts your internet activity, and it keeps snoopers out of your business. Plus, it's packed with extras like Surfshark Alert, which notifies you if your personal info is leaked in a data breach, and Surfshark Search, an ad-free private search engine. And if you're still not satisfied, no problem. Surfshark comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So go to surfshark.com/sideprojects to try it out and get 4 extra months for free with your subscription. That's surfshark.com/sideprojects. Your privacy deserves Surfshark. And now, back to today's video. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the British had control over the whole Indian subcontinent, first arriving on the back of merchant freighters and later returning on the back of battleships. The British were responsible for untold numbers of dead in India, including famines that led to the deaths of millions. But it would be British administrative efforts that would leave the longest-lasting wound. The British withdrew from India in 1947, orchestrated on just 6 weeks' notice. The hastily organized mess would plague the nations that rose from it for generations to come. The partition itself was brutal. Targeted killings and abductions were common on all sides. It's believed that up to 2 million people perished in the violence. Many more were displaced as one of the largest mass migrations of people in human history was carried out in mere weeks. India and Pakistan would go on to fight several wars over their new borders, including in Kashmir, which today sits as a frozen conflict with an uneasy peace having settled across a landscape defined by decades of violence. Further bloodshed would arise when East Pakistan, an area with no real connection to the rest of Pakistan, revolted. A 9-month guerrilla war fought in the early 1970s was the cost of self-determination for the new nation of Bangladesh, another British administrative blunder that led to the deaths of countless people. The legacy of the British in India and the way in which they withdrew ultimately ensured that there would be no peace on the subcontinent for decades. Sudan is another case of the British drawing lines that would cause untold issues in the future, this time in Africa. Britain held on to Sudan from the late 19th century into the mid-20th, administered as a colony under the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. London relied on keeping its colonies divided in order to rule over them and deter united uprisings from the people. Sudan was one such example. The so-called Southern policy ensured that North and South Sudan were administered separately. The British focused on economically developing the Muslim North. They built infrastructure, including railways, telegraphs, and schools. In the South, there was little infrastructure development, it was closed to the outside world, and Christian missionaries were banned from going to the North to preserve its religious identity. Isolated and underdeveloped compared to its northern counterpart, this stirred up grievances between the territories. But when Sudan gained its independence in the 1950s, grievances turned into violence, and a bloody civil war ensued that lasted for decades as the South fought for greater autonomy. Disease, famine, and war would result in the deaths of millions until South Sudan gained its independence in 2011 after half a century of war. Since then, South Sudan has continued to struggle, whilst the North has been in the grips of its own civil war and humanitarian crisis since 2018. If the British Empire had treated the North and South as equals, their historical grievances may have been resolvable, and many lives could have been spared in the conflicts that followed, even the ones today. To say that the conflict between Israel and Palestine is solely Britain's fault wouldn't be right. People have been fighting over this land for centuries, and whilst it's more complicated than any short YouTube video could explain, Britain is partially responsible for Israel's modern history. At the height of Britain's industrial power, two diplomats sat down in 1916 to divide up the Middle East, a Brit named Mark Sykes and a Frenchman named François Picot. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it was known, stipulated that after World War I was over, the two empires would seize influence over the Arab world, with certain territories gaining independence. A year later, Britain's Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour made a public pledge to help establish a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And this created a problem. The British had made assurances to the Arabs over Palestine. A leaked memorandum from the Foreign Office at the time read as follows: "With regard to Palestine, His Majesty's government are committed by Sir Henry McMahon's letter to the Sheriff on October 24, 1915, to its inclusion in the boundaries of Arab independence, but they have stated their policy regarding the Palestine holy place and Zionist colonization in their message to him of January 4, 1918. End quote. Essentially, the British had promised the Jewish people a homeland and Palestinian independence at the same time. In the 1920s and 30s, Britain assisted with the immigration of European Jews to Palestine, resulting in a pattern of resistance and violence from Palestinians. Inquiries were launched suggesting the alteration of policy on a Jewish homeland, but it never happened. But by 1948, Israel had declared its independence and with it launched the Nakba, a campaign of violence, massacres, and the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians. If Britain had not tried to promise all things to all people, a lot of bloodshed could have been averted. The legacy of the conflict between Israel and Palestine today is fought in Gaza and the West Bank, representing an everlasting stain on British colonial history. Burma, as it was known, has a long history with the British, much like Afghanistan, with several wars being fought there over the 19th century. It was eventually subsumed into British India until 1937, and it wouldn't gain independence until 1948. The British oversaw the exploitation of Myanmar, paving the way for the nation to be riddled with conflict in its independence. They stoked division amongst ethnic groups to divide and conquer. Those loyal to the British were given privileges over others, exacerbating already existing tensions. Such tensions eventually led to the genocide of the Rohingya Muslims years later, many of whom were brought to Myanmar by the British as a form of cheap labor. The British also only built the necessary infrastructure to exploit Burma and its people, leading to a post-independence wealth disparity and birthing separatist movements in poorer areas. This resulted in those in power seeking to consolidate their position centrally. A strong military presence has therefore been the cause of military juntas ruling Myanmar for the majority of its independence. This also meant that Myanmar's institutions and state structures outside of the military have not been developed in the same way as other nations post-independence, which sustained the army's power. In 2021, the nation suffered another coup, emphasizing the legacy of the British Empire, putting Myanmar on this path in the first place all these decades later. Countless people have been killed in the brutal military regimes that have ruled over the country, and Myanmar still grapples with separatists to this day. The fighting has also led to Myanmar becoming severely underdeveloped in the 21st century, and with very little stability for the future. So when looking back on the British Empire's legacy on the world, It's not difficult to see why nations may hold a grudge. The British Empire was a brutal one that took what it could and subjugated what it could not. Its effects are still felt today, even though it's really long gone. Perhaps many of these nations would still have fallen into the trappings of modern nation building, but we cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that the British Empire played a crucial part in the histories of these nations. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but for some of those they ruled over, it never rose again. Thank you for watching.